C.S. Lewis once wrote that early Christians were not convinced through the reading of Jesus' biography. The gospel accounts, he said, were written later to edify Christians already made. The earliest converts to Christianity, explained Lewis, were made by a single historical fact, the resurrection of Christ, operating, he said, on a sense of sin they already had. And many of those Christians, perhaps the majority in the first century, were made as a direct result of the evangelism of a witness to the risen Lord, the persecutor turned preacher, Paul. But as we approach Easter, many will be wondering, is the resurrection Paul preached really a historical fact? Can it be established beyond a reasonable doubt? Our guest today has spent his professional career arguing that it is, and it can. Dr. Gary Habermas is an author, historian, New Testament scholar, and philosopher of religion who's been described by no less than Rational Wiki as the greatest apologist for the resurrection of Jesus in the world. Dr. Habermas is a distinguished research professor of apologetics and philosophy at Liberty University. He's the author of over 40 books, including The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus and Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? The Resurrection Debate. And today we're going to talk about some of the evidence that the resurrection is a historical fact, more firmly established even than many of the facts and figures secular historians routinely take for granted. Dr. Habermas, thanks for joining me on the BreakPoint Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Well, Shane, I'm glad to be with you. And, of course, this is my favorite topic, and it's a favorite time of the year, so we've got a good one.
Well, this is the time of year that this becomes the center of conversation. But I have to ask, why the resurrection? I know many, probably outsiders to Christianity, will be wondering that. You've zeroed in on this one event as kind of the linchpin, the thing that holds the whole Christian story together and on which it stands or falls. Why is that? Why not say, the virgin birth or Jesus' other miracles? What is it about the resurrection you think makes for such a powerful apologetic?
Well, first of all, it's what the New Testament says. I know that sounds like a flippant kind of answer, but actually critical scholars, we're talking atheists and agnostic and Jewish New Testament specialists, take that very, very seriously. They do not doubt for a moment, and this is a way to answer your question, but when it's the atheists, agnostics, and Jewish New Testament scholars, it's very interesting that they say, here's Bart Ehrman, the atheist New Testament scholar. He says the New Testament and the whole Christianity, all Christian, conversions and so on, they all happened because of the disciples' unquestioning, unswerving belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And then he goes on and he says, now you wonder why I would say that. And he said, I don't hesitate to say it because it's a fact of history and it's true. So from an atheist New Testament scholar that's quite substantial. Scholar.
I feel like Christians have this idea often, and then outsiders to the faith also have this idea that if you want to convince a skeptic of the resurrection of Jesus and the New Testament's claims, that you can't use the New Testament itself, that it's actually off limits for some reason. And you say that this claim is actually profoundly misguided. Why is that?
It's totally misguided. And the quickest way to point that out is, let's say, Bart Ehrman, again, atheist New Testament scholar, Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? I wouldn't suggest it for somebody who, unless they're, used to dealing with doubts, but it's actually pretty good in a lot of regards. And he makes the comment that, well, like I said a moment ago, it's true because the disciples absolutely believed it. And that's super. But then he says this, he says, am I quoting verses because it's in the Bible and I'm just used to quoting verses?
Yeah.
And he quotes dozens and dozens. And he says, no, I don't quote it because it's the New Testament. The fact that it's in the New Testament doesn't mean anything in terms of inspiration. I quote the verses I do in the New Testament because I know where to go to the ones that are well evidenced. And I cite the well evidenced verses from the New Testament. So that's the key. And I'll just give you one example. He lists 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. 15 independent sources, and four of the 15 are not even in the New Testament.
It's safe to say this happened.
Absolutely. He doesn't have a question. And you are going to find when you go down the list, that's also this season, crucifixion, John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, they're co-founders of the Jesus Seminar, probably equally skeptical as Bart Ehrman. And they both say, paraphrasing them, but they both say almost the same thing. that the crucifixion of Jesus is arguably the best authenticated fact in the ancient world.
And that's because the New Testament itself is a historical document and should be treated as such, and is treated as such by the skeptics.
Well, sort of like a yes and no. Bart Ehrman would say, and those other two guys would say, most likely they would explain it as, it's not a reliable document per se. There's a lot of things I don't buy, and that's because I'm a skeptic, speaking for them.
Right.
But since I know, like the spider that does not get caught in its own web because it knows what strands to walk on, these guys know which strands in the New Testament are reliable. So they're not going to accept everything in the New Testament is reliable, but there's enough reliable material to make your case. And that's why they don't question the crucifixion or the disciples' belief that Jesus was raised.
Okay, so what about miracles then? I hear an objection oftentimes that, the Bible makes supernatural claims, therefore it's disqualified. It can't be treated the same as we would treat, say, biographies of characters like Alexander the Great or the founders of Rome or something like that. What do you say to that?
You know what? The kind of guys who make those comments, just in that one sentence you made, there's about 3 mistakes that critical New Testament scholars would not say. But you say, well, people do say those things. They do. But they're very frequently popularists who are not scholars, who call themselves scholars, who don't have any backup to prove. I'm not trying to be mean. Bart Ehrman goes off on them, the Jesus mythicists. He goes off on them for, 30 pages in his book. He just says, you guys don't know what you're talking about. And he argues against him, and you're going to think, if you listen to it, you're going to think, oh, man, he must be one of us or something. But no, he's not. But he just knows that there is good data for these things. So the guys who say those things, I'll just go through each of those real fast. Number one, what if I told you that of the New Testament specialists, I don't care if they're atheist, I don't care if they're agnostic, don't care if they're Jewish, don't care if there's some other religion, if they're specialists, so they have a PhD in a relevant field, New Testament, theology, classics, history, philosophy, something relevant, they are going to say, in fact, I've heard figures from them as high as phrases like virtually 100% of critics today, scholarly critics, are going to say that Jesus was taught to be a miracle worker in the New Testament. Of course, nobody doubts that. And they believe that a good deal of those events that we call healings and demon exorcisms actually occurred. And there might be 2 groups of them. One, you might say, well, are you saying it's a miracle? And a lot of them would say, well, look, I'm not even going to discuss the supernatural element. Okay, right. So I'm an atheist. These guys, I'm an atheist. So I don't think anything supernatural is going on. But if what you're asking me, and this is about as bad as it gets, if what you're asking me is, do a lot of the stories that the Gospels record regarding healing and exorcisms, did those stories or ones just like them occur? The answer is yes. Okay, there's one. Then there's another error in that comment that these popularists are going to make, but the scholars are not. They're going to say, why can't they all be like Alexander? Okay, that's a joke. In the ancient world, 2 things about Alexander. The earliest source for Alexander, the earliest written detailed, I don't mean an inscription in a rock, I mean the earliest detailed source about Alexander was written almost 300 years later. Compare that to Mark, and when these guys that call themselves scholars, but they're popularists and they're not scholars really, according to Ehrman now, they're going to say, are you kidding me? Mark was written 40 years after the cross. Yeah, right. Well, compare that to Alexander plus 300. Well, John was 65 years later. Wonderful. Compare that to 300. And Bart Ehrman himself, he counts all sources within 100 years of the crucifixion. That's his wavelength where he thinks it's relevant. And John is only 2/3 of the way through that line. So, okay, and then, so the comment that nobody believes that those events happen, wrong. Skeptics almost always concede them. Now, what they are they supernatural or are they just, they could be, we go to counseling today because counselors can talk us through things. A licensed counselor can talk us through something. We call that healing. Right. And Jesus could have done that. So they think healing took place, but are you going to ask, were they supernatural? That's different for every single person. But did the events occur? A lot of agreement. You go, what about Alexander? Yeah, not even comparable. And I mean, a critic like E.P. Sanders calls himself a liberal and was a professor at both Oxford and Duke universities. Sanders says the same thing about Alexander 300 years later and so on and so on. And lastly, when these guys go, yeah, but you're looking at historians, we're looking at Christian supernatural stuff. Since 1990, I'll give you details if you want, but since 1990, the most popular New Testament view is that the Gospels are species, they're types of Greco-Roman biography. These are major changes in research, and it's why critics are taking a whole new look at this thing.
Well, and it's staggering, too, when you look at the time gaps between historical figures like Alexander and then the earliest detailed texts about them. I mean, that's a time gap greater than between us and George Washington. It's like if somebody were to sit down and try to write the first ever, or at least the one that survives, biography about George Washington right now. I mean, how reliable would you consider that? But we do consider the text on Alexander reasonably reliable. But by comparison, the text on this Jesus person are so close to the events that they describe that they're kind of the cream of the crop in terms of historical documentation.
Oh, you're right. Let me tell you two more things. When I said Mark at plus 40 and John at plus 65, which would put Mark at 70 and John at 95, those are regular dates for the four Gospels. But critics, Bart Ehrman, atheist, Gert Ludemann, atheist, New Testament scholars, these guys think that our earliest sources, I'll just take the time to explain, so it's whether you want to go into it or not, but just the bare fact, these guys think that the earliest reports, actual reports on the death and resurrection of Jesus happened between 1, 2, or maybe as late as 3 years after the cross. We have sources, not Mark at plus 40. I mean, Mark's great. But what about 1, 2, or 3 years after the cross? And the other thing, when you say, yeah, what about Alexander again? Here's my funny kind of response to that, one that I haven't made yet. I would say, oh, so those guys are the histories, and the Gospels are just the miracle-working ones, right? Yeah. Okay, well, let me tell you something. Almost every ancient Greco-Roman author tells miracle stories. Almost everyone. Here's how Plutarch's Alexander starts, which, by the way, is highly accredited at about 450 years later. Not 300, 450. Here's how Plutarch starts. He says, it's commonly believed that Alexander was the son of a god and that his mother was a virgin. And as I tell my audiences, wow, it's a good thing Plutarch isn't into the supernatural.
Yeah.
That's how those histories work, which makes you think, oh, so they're all bad, right? No, critics don't do that. But from an apologetic viewpoint, maybe these guys are right that the universe is a supernatural place. Just maybe, just a thought.
So you call your approach to defending the claim of Jesus' resurrection the minimal facts approach, and you grant skeptics dates, you grant the list of New Testament books that they agree are authentic, and you even say that given this skeleton canon we're granting, we can demonstrate that the resurrection is the only satisfying explanation or plausible explanation for the available evidence. Walk us through how that approach works.
Yeah. I do a lot of interviews on this topic, and usually I have to stop and say, no, you kind of, and how do you tell somebody what they just said was wrong and you want to correct them? Well, you just did a great job, and that doesn't happen a lot. You did a good job explaining that. I would say in a sentence, I wouldn't even hardly say it differently than what you said, but just to repeat it in one sentence, I would say you can take the facts, which the atheist New Testament scholars, of which Bart Ehrman and Gert Ludemann are great examples, you can take their data, throw in there John Dominic Cross and Marcus Borg. Now, they're not atheists, but they're very skeptical, co-founders of the Jesus Seminar. You can take those four guys, you can take the facts they allow, because almost every scholar admits these. We're talking 90-something%, and I did a head count on them. So they'll give you a number of facts, and my argument in this sentence is you can take those facts, their facts, and show that the resurrection is the best explanation for those facts, better than any other explanation, and that's because you can refute the other explanations of the same facts. it doubles as evidence for the resurrection and evidence against, the disciples sold the body, Jesus wasn't dead, which virtually nobody says anymore.
So let me throw an objection out here that somebody might give, and you answer it for me. The resurrection story is a late accretion to the Jesus tale that kind of was added on sometime maybe late in the first century. It continued, but before that, there were lots of different claims about who Jesus was, what his gospel was, what he did, whether he rose from the dead, and that claim was just the one that won out. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's the diversity argument, because today, now these are the more radical scholars, not the guys that like a Bart Ehrman would be, I don't think you'd hear him saying it like that at all. But what you say about those is, first of all, your late first century, we've got sources going back. Paul doesn't do a lot of history about Jesus. He doesn't do the Gospels, but he does talk a fair amount about facts in Jesus' life. And he starts in 1 Thessalonians, and everybody puts it about 50 AD. That's plus 20.
And they credit that to him.
They credit it to him. There's 7 epistles out of 13 that bear Paul's name. They will grant 7. And maybe evangelicals are really surprised to learn that the 7 they grant are the ones that evangelicals most want to use. I'll give you a quick list. They will grant Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and 1 Thessalonians, along with the 1 chapter, Philemon. They grant all those. And when I say, what do you mean by grant them? They don't think they're inspired. No, they don't think they're inspired. But, they think they're reliable. Okay, Paul, those 7 are reliable, unlike what they think about the Gospels, which I said the books aren't reliable, but some facts in them are reliable. Right. Paul, they think the whole thing is, if they could define what reliable means, yeah. And what do you mean by reliable for Paul? Well, here's what they would say. He's not inspired, you understand. I don't believe in that. He's not inspired. This is the critics, not me. It's not inspired, but he was an apostle, a very sharp guy. Read the book of Romans. He knows how to put an argument together. He basically had a PhD in Old Testament. Plus, he had the distinction of being a critic of these things, converted by what he believed was a resurrection appearance of Jesus. And we have his own words on that. Other words, he's an eyewitness to his experience. And they will use Paul's epistles before they'll use Acts, but 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 15, and so on. And Paul would not willingly mislead you. He could be wrong about something, the critics would say, but not likely, and he at least has given you a perspective that for the view of a lot of people in his day that was true. So all those things make those 7 epistles of Paul pretty reliable. And if you quote from those 7 epistles, they can say yes, but they're not going to say you can't use those sources. But then, okay, so if that starts with 1 Thessalonians at 50 AD, that's only plus 20 after the cross. What are we going to do with these early sources? They're called creeds. The New Testament's full of them. There's a couple dozen of them. And Bart Ehrman says they could all have come from Jerusalem. Paul could have gotten them from the apostles when he visited there, Galatians 1:18, when he visited and talked to Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. He could have gotten all the creeds right in those first 3 years. So, okay, Mark is fine at 45. Paul's epistles are fantastic. They would put Paul's epistles at about 50 to 63 AD. That's great. But how about these early sources that go back 1 to 2, 3 years afterwards? That includes 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. That's the most important resurrection passage in the New Testament. And it is usually the consensus New Testament view. Consensus. Critics put that in the first 3, maybe 4 years after the cross.
Well, what claims do we find in that early consensus creed?
Well, here's how he introduces the creed. He doesn't say creed, but that's our word, a creed or a tradition. Well, he does use the word tradition, and in the same book, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he calls it the communion passage tradition. But here's how he starts, verse 3. I delivered unto you that which also received. That's how I call that a first century footnote. He's telling you this material is not his. I'm giving you something I was given when I came to the Lord. So I delivered you that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, rose again the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and appeared to Peter and the 12. That's the beginning of it. And in this list that's coming up, there are 3 appearances to groups, the 12, a group called all the apostles, which is larger than the 12, and the 500, and that might be men alone. It says 500 brethren. Now, unless he's using that like you guys, and it means everybody, he could just mean men, like the feeding of the 5,000 could have been feeding of 12,000 because it's a men count.
So we're talking 1,000 people in that case.
Oh, it could be. If he means men, if he's doing a male head count, yeah, I think there'd be more than 1,000 in that 500 appearance. And then he's got 2 appearances to individuals, Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and then he adds his name to the end. It's not part of the creed, but then he said, last of all, he appeared to me. So that's one of the times where Paul talks about his own appearance. So if you count the whole thing, 3 individuals, 3 groups, 1, no matter what the number is, 500,000, 1,200, whatever, it's a very large group. So all early. There's probably no more respected passage in the New Testament than that one, and maybe no greater commented passage than that one in the New Testament. That's how seriously critics take it.
That's incredible. It's like the one that has the most apologetic content and potential is the one that the critics are most certain is authentic.
And now you know why they can say, I used to use a phrase, I'm a little more careful about it, but I'll use it here. I'll say, you can disbelieve the resurrection, but you can't disprove it. Okay, They don't believe, the guys I'm talking about, atheists and so on, agnostics, they don't believe the resurrection, but they believe we have the statements of the earliest witnesses who believed it with all their heart.
Right.
And again, it's Bart Ehrman, the atheist, who says, why wouldn't I believe this? It's established by our historical research.
I hope you're enjoying my interview with Dr. Gary Habermas, which we'll get back to in just a moment. But first, I wanted to let you know that our next short course, How the Church Can Restore Culture's Brokenness, kicks off tomorrow night, Tuesday, April 7th at 8 p.m. Eastern. Dr. Kathy Cook, president of Celebrate Kids, will talk about how Christians can respond to loneliness, isolation, and relational brokenness. Then, on consecutive Tuesday evenings, Ricky Shillette, Executive Director of Living Hope Ministries, will talk about how Christians can respond to the sexually broken. C. Ben Mitchell, Professor of Moral Philosophy at Union University, will talk about how Christians can lead in end-of-life care. And finally, David Galvin, Director of Education for a Lifetime, on mental health and addiction. Come to breakpoint.org to register. I hope to see you tomorrow night. Now, back to Gary Habermas. So we cannot say that the resurrection was a later addition at some point that became part of Christianity. The earliest records we have of Christianity, going back even potentially to the 5 years after the events they're talking about, are making this claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Would it be fair to say, Dr. Habermas, that Paul could not make a claim like that, referring to the witnesses and so forth, if they didn't actually exist and if they didn't actually think that Jesus had risen from the dead?
Yeah, even leave out the part about Paul wouldn't say it if. Just you could say it the way the critics do, and they would say there were a lot of people running around in those days, apostles included, who believed that they saw the risen Jesus. Yes, you go, well, so was Paul so-and-so and so on when he said that? Just skip that. They will concede that there were people running around saying, I saw the risen Jesus.
So there's no evidence at all for this kind of primitive Christianity prior to the central assertions of Paul's, the stanzas in 1 Corinthians 15, where he gives the creed that includes death, burial, and resurrection, and then according to the scriptures. So there's even a sort of atonement theology there, as J. Gresham Machen points out.
Right, yeah, because he said died for their sins according to the scriptures.
Right.
And by the way, there are other creeds that say that other creeds that talk about the blood of Christ or dying for sins. Yes, there are other creeds that say the same thing. I can give you a list of those creeds, but that would be another program. And the critics take the creeds very seriously, very early. As far as your other part of that question, what you just implied again in this one, are there ones that tell a different tale? Not in this early period. And nothing can be earlier than this, right, because what critics admit about these creeds, and again, Bart Ehrman saying Paul definitely knew that these things were being taught when he was persecuting the church. He already knew their claims. That's why he was ticked. That's why he was doing things. So he knew the material. Secondly, he probably received all the creeds he reports, and Paul reports more of them than, of course, he wrote more books than anybody, but he recorded more creeds than anybody. And Ehrman says he may very well have gotten all of them in Jerusalem by the time he visited Jerusalem, which is +5, and he could have known about it much sooner. Here's another example. James D.G. Dunn, who's as influential as any historical, he's a moderate, but he's as influential as any New Testament scholar today. And Dunn says, how old is this creed in 1 Corinthians 15? We're not talking Mark at +40 or John at +65. How old is this 1 Corinthians 15 creed? He says it was probably dated months after the resurrection. Now, unlike Christmas, we know the time of the year when Easter happened, and it's a spring event. You have a lot of months between right now and the end of our year, 2020. There's a lot of months. Right. So if Dunn is right that this thing could have been out, if it could have been noised abroad in a creedal form and preached within months, it could have been, and he's not the only one that says this, but it could have been 30 A.D. This report may have been out the same year. I mean, and by the way, who did it come from? Bart Ehrman says Paul could very well have gotten it from the apostles, and in particular from James and Peter when he went to Jerusalem. So what are you talking? You're talking extremely early. Nothing could be earlier. And even Bart Ehrman says, where do we get closer to eyewitness testimony than this? Now, Ehrman doesn't grant eyewitness testimony of the four Gospels. But even if an evangelical said, well, I believe Matthew and John were eyewitnesses, and I think Mark and Luke were written based on eyewitness testimony, Ehrman would say, you're not getting my point. I'm telling you that this makes Mark look sad. Mark's fine, but he's +40. I'm telling you +1 to 3. Actually, he says +1 to 2.
So the ground for skeptics to stand on, and this, I want to help our listeners understand just what a tectonic shift this is, because for so long, naturalistic theories of the resurrection and dismissals on the basis of, well, you can't trust what the Bible says, were kind of accepted, weren't they? I mean, that was kind of a claim you could make, but the state of New Testament scholarship is such that now those claims have been backed off a cliff. It's just really, really hard to make that claim, and the skeptic has extremely little ground to stand on at this point. They've got to say that the first followers of Jesus were utterly convinced that he had risen from the dead, and they lived their lives in light of this. Every
skeptic who writes is going to say that sentence. Now, if you pointed out, well, John Doe doesn't, all right, you might dig one out of the rocks, but I'm going to tell you, I don't know who you'd pick. There's going to be somebody out there who says that, but I'm not aware of one. And when the critics say it, they're going to say that everybody conceded that. And like, again, Bart Ehrman says it's a fact of history. So it's early, and Bart Ehrman says, now again, so my point was when evangelicals go, yeah, but we don't need any more eyewitnesses. We have 2 of the 4 Gospels eyewitnesses, and the other 2 got it from eyewitnesses. Bart would say, yeah, well, Paul going to Jerusalem at +5 after the cross, talking to Peter and James, and probably being aware of the creeds before he got there anyway, because they were in existence, that beats the Gospels all to pieces as far as evidence is concerned. And you go, well, yeah, but they were only talking about the Gospel. And by the way, Paul went back before 1 Thessalonians, before the first epistle comes out. Paul went back at the end of the 40s, late 40s, that's Galatians 2, 1 through 10, and critics totally admit that. Mm-hmm. He went back to talk about the Gospel. Now, what's the gospel? Minimum deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. And who's there now? Peter's there. Oh, great. He was there in chapter 1. Yep, he's still there in chapter 2. James, the brother of Jesus. Yeah, he was there too. Yep, and now he's there in 2. And now John is there. And what's significant is these are the big 4. Nobody is more influential than James, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, Paul, and John. No one. So now you've got the biggest names conceding the gospel. All of them claim to be witnesses of the resurrection appearances. And Bart says that's testimony that you don't even have in the Gospels. It's funny that they're making the case for us. And now if you say, well, then, okay, great. So they don't believe this stuff. Yeah, not usually. There's a few of them, more moderate critics will believe the resurrection happened. Huh. But you go, well, if it's so good, why don't they believe it? And I mean, that's probably the most common question I get. If the data is so good and they agree with it, why aren't they Christians? And there's a really easy answer. Most people don't become Christians because of facts. Even if they're facts, most people become Christians because they want to adopt a different philosophy than the one they hold. So if I gave you an example, I use this one all the time. If we were best friends and you were single and I was married, and I believe that the married life is fantastic and you need it. And I go, hey, listen, buddy, what if I introduce you to the greatest woman in the world, and I think if you meet her, you'll agree with me? And you go, well, I hate blind dates, but okay, because I trust you so much. All right, I'll ask her. And you guys end up going on a few dates, and a few weeks later you tell me, this gal is everything you said she was. And I'll go, great. Can I be your best man? And you say to me, you are missing my point. I concede your comment that she's the greatest woman I've ever met. But it doesn't follow that I want a relationship. It doesn't follow that I want to get married. Because you're asking me for an I do that will tie me down for the rest of my life. So we decided to be really good friends, but I'm not ready to say I do right now. So these critics, they may believe the data that people think these things are true. They're not going to believe it. They think there's a little bit of an out there, but they're not ready to get married. They're not ready to say I do to Jesus. And that's the reason they don't believe. But as to the extent that I've described their belief, I don't think they're going to argue a whole lot with what I've said from the data.
That's incredible. It
is.
Yeah, it's like there's a prior commitment there that prevents the further step of actually acknowledging what the facts seem to demonstrate. I'm reminded of this.
Cool.
I don't know if you know the Lutheran Satire YouTube channel. It's great, but I know the guy who runs that, Hans Feeney. But he has this one episode where Donald and Connell, these two Irishmen, ancient Irishmen who met St. Patrick and formerly criticized his, Trinitarian analogies. They meet Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins comes in and he goes, well, we know that Jesus didn't rise from the dead because people don't rise from the dead. And Donald and Connell are like, well, how do you know people don't rise from the dead? And he goes, because we have no examples of people rising from the dead. And they're like, well, yeah, except for that time that God rose Jesus from the dead. So if you discount a priori that people rise from the dead, then you have to stop short. You can't go that extra step and say, all right, well, the evidence seems to point to resurrection. I'm going to believe it.
Yeah, now these same guys, and even the more scientific atheists, Michael Roos and so on, Dawkins is really well known, but he doesn't cut it for almost any atheist. He doesn't cut it for the scientific kind, and he doesn't cut it for these New Testament kind, because they would just say he's not into the data. Now, they could very well say, I think if you asked Bart Ehrman, he'd say, well, Dawkins is right that miracles don't happen, and Dawkins is therefore right that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, but not the way he's getting there, and he certainly doesn't know how good the data are. But, just in a recent book, you'd say, well, then you probably, Dr. Ehrman, you are probably coming up with a naturalistic theory why this didn't happen, right? He said in a recent book doesn't like naturalistic theories. It's just enough to say that according to David Hume, miracles are highly unlikely, and that's good enough for him. But the day of the naturalistic theories, a naturalistic theory, by definition, would be like this. For Dawkins to say Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that's not a naturalistic theory. That's just a denial. Right. And I can deny anything. I can say the best football team in the world is not the best football team in the world. I can just say that. But if you're going to say Jesus didn't rise from the dead because this happened in its place and it's not supernatural, that's a naturalistic theory. Critics have largely given up filling in the blank. They'll say Jesus didn't rise because I believe that's my philosophy, just like I don't want to get married. My philosophy is Jesus didn't rise from the dead. But it's not a naturalistic theory until they say what really happened is fill in the blank. And they don't like to make those theories up. And Bart Ehrman even says why. He says, when I was an evangelical, I would be drooling if somebody made up a theory because all the data go against it. Man, I'm going to pile drive you with reasons against that theory. And he goes, well, I don't need to say anything because miracles are highly unlikely. But the point is, if you back off of naturalistic theories, if you're a critic and you're not going to say anymore what you really think happened, you're just going to say, I don't believe it, miracles are really unlikely. That's a lot, I think, weaker view than saying the same thing, I don't believe in miracles, and here's what I think happened, I have data for it. But they don't have data for the other views. It's a lost art of going after naturalistic theories.
It's like they're backed into a corner. What do you do? Let's ask an alternative question here. What do you do with someone who, instead of saying, well, I'm not ready to get married, I don't want to make that commitment, I don't want to convert to Christianity, who says, okay, you got me. I think that the evidence for the resurrection is so good, I have to accept that it likely took place. what's next?
Uh-huh.
How do you pastorally work with a person like that who is open to the possibility of Jesus actually having validated his deity with resurrection?
Okay, there's that guy who actually has written a book on this. Now, he doesn't like the deity part, but the fact that there was a resurrection, the guy's passed away now, but in the early 80s, it was either 82 or 83, this guy's name is Pinchas Lapid. He's Jewish. He remained Jewish. He's not a Jewish guy who trusted Christ.
Right.
He's Jewish, but he's got a PhD in New Testament from a German university, so he's a really well-accredited New Testament scholar. And he wrote a book called The Resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish Perspective. And he said, the evidence is fantastic, most of all 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, and Jesus is raised from the dead. And then he says, well, then you probably think I think he's the Messiah. Well, I'm Jewish, so I don't think he's the Messiah, but he seems to lean toward this view that's very common among intellectual Jews, which is kind of like, why should I be upset with saying Jesus was a prophet? He was a prophet. He's one of my own race. He's Jewish. He's a good guy, a great ethicist. So, and what this view, I think Lapid is kind of there. He doesn't spell it out exactly, but I think he kind of says this, is that Jesus is the Gentiles' Messiah. So is he the Messiah? Well, for everybody else but the Jews. I get there a different way. I get there by the law. But for Gentiles, yeah, so he's going a long way on this one, and he definitely believes the resurrection is an historical fact.
That's interesting. It reminds me a lot of, there's an author named Sholem Ash who wrote during the 40s or 50s, I believe.
I know of him, yes.
So The Nazarene is the book that I've read from him, and he's a Jewish author, never officially converted to Christianity that I know of. He remained a Jew, a professing Jew his whole life, and yet he wrote this book about Jesus, the Nazarene, and portrays him very clearly as the Messiah. And then he even at the end strongly implies, in the kind of way Mark does, that he resurrected. He acknowledges the fact that the disciples thought Jesus was resurrected. And he got in trouble for that, in his own community. But it was exactly the kind of openness that you're describing to Jesus.
Yeah, I've read him. In fact, I required one of his writings years ago in one of my grad classes. But tell me this, do you think when he says Messiah, does he mean he's the Messiah for Gentiles? Or does he mean he's the Messiah of everybody? It's unlikely he would say he's the Messiah for Jews, but I don't know.
It seems like he treats him as a messianic figure for the Jews as well. And the thing that's strongest about the Nazarene is that it is a very Jewish book. It's almost like I would, if I were giving people advice on what to read, just to get familiar with the idea of Jesus being Jewish in his Jewish context, I would tell them to read the Nazarene because he uses all the original names, instead of the Hellenized ones. He gives us a very Jewish picture of Jesus. And it's beautiful. It's just beautiful writing. And as a Christian, there are obviously moments when I'd object, but
Sure. But you're also very surprised that they grant what they grant.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Dr. Habermas, it's been just an enormous treat having you on here, especially as we come up on Easter. I think many of us are getting kind of stir crazy being locked into our houses, with the coronavirus and everything. So these conversations are just crucial to have. I think not only because we want to be confident in our faith as Christians, but also because this is our ultimate hope, right? This is where we're grounded, is the fact that death is not the end, that sickness doesn't have the final word, that Jesus did get up and walk out of the grave, and that we too will be pulled out of our graves when he returns, and we'll see him as he is. Thank you so much.
I'll tell you what, the resurrection is tied to almost every major doctrine in the New Testament, but the one that it's most tied to, almost 20 times in the New Testament, we're told that believers will be raised just like Jesus was. So that's the ultimate personal truth that comes from resurrection.
Dr. Habermas, where can our listeners go to find out more about your work?
Well, probably, unless they get one of my books, over 40 of them, by the way. But by the way, on the over 40, half of them are on the resurrection. So they can find things, the Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, co-authored Mike Lacona and me, or the one with that just my name is on it, The Risen Jesus and Future Hope. They're all available. I don't sell anything on my website, but if they go to my website, GaryHabermas.com, they can get a whole lot of lectures, articles, a whole lot of things on the resurrection, just not whole books. But the whole thing's there. I don't sell anything. It's for ministry's sake. It's for people who have questions. So if they want to get a book, great. If they want to go to the website, they can browse and not spend a penny.
And Dr. Habermas is really, thank you so much. You're really kind of a one-man show here, a PowerPoint operation in human flesh, I've heard it said. And if you go on, folks, if you go on YouTube, go on Vimeo, just look up Gary Habermas, and you're going to find a wealth of talks, debates, all kinds of great stuff where he walks you through all of these arguments. So be sure and check that out. Thank you so much.
You're very, very kind. Thank you.
Dr. Gary
listen,
Habermas.
I'll repeat the accolades here. I do a lot of interviews, hundreds, and your questions today, it's obvious that you've done some research before you ask these. A lot of people ask questions, and you have to gently, especially the show's live, you have to gently tell them they're barking up the wrong tree. Let's rephrase that question. How do you do that? Well, I don't have to do that with any of your things. Your questions are fantastic. You go right to the meat of the issue, like a creed is earlier than Mark and Paul's earlier than Mark, that kind of stuff. And I really appreciate your question today.
Well, thank you so much. That means a lot. Dr. Gary Habermas of Liberty University, thanks so much for joining me today on the BreakPoint Podcast. Thanks so much for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. Please remember to come to breakpoint.org to register for our next short course, How the Church Can Respond to Culture's Brokenness. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.